Okay, it's Friday morning. I'm Professor St. Clair, of course. We're going to do History 117, Chapter 22, Africa and the Atlantic World. But before we get started on that, I just answered a bunch of course messages. I screwed up when I guess when I was setting things up, I just plugged in dates that I wasn't thinking really. And so it's mostly in the 131 classes. People are freaking out. And I put up an announcement. I put up a schedule of dates that are the legitimate dates. And people are still freaking out. So September 9th, we already did the first artifact, right? The Columbus one. The paper is due on October 15th. Today is the 2nd, so you should have been thinking about it. I'll do a separate video in the next day or two on the paper itself. Okay. The 19th is the second artifact. The 26th is the third artifact. So I'll have to get those up soon. I think that's the most important thing. I've just learned how to set up discussions, and we'll see how it goes in the 131 class. Those dates are a little tentative, but October 20th for the first discussion, and I'll have more to say about that in a bit. That's all the stuff that I don't enjoy doing. Dates, grading. I like teaching history, but I don't like the sort of the bureaucracy of it all. And I know you guys mostly care about your points, but well, that's how it is, okay? So chapter 22 is Africa and the Atlantic World. And what do they mean by the Atlantic World? Well, as long as you just had Europe and Africa and this ocean that nobody had crossed, there wasn't really an Atlantic world. All the action in the Eastern Hemisphere was taking place in the Indian Ocean. That's where all the trade was happening. That's where the exchange of ideas and plants and that kind of thing. They always mention the Columbian exchange, but there's an earlier, Islamic exchange where citrus fruits are taken from one part of the world and introduced into other parts of the world. And think about it. You're 30 years old and you've never had an orange, and then somebody brings oranges to you. That's pretty spectacular, I would imagine. Stuff like that. But once Columbus and the other conquerors get across the ocean, the Atlantic world sort of draws away from the Indian Ocean, more or less, and becomes a sort of separate entity itself. And it's a world that includes Europe and Africa, mostly West Africa, and then South America, the Caribbean, and North America, right? There's trade back and forth. It's the Middle Passage for slaves. It's sugar going to Europe, manufactured goods going to Africa, etc., etc. And it's this is kind of an important. It's a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-racial world. There are Africans, there are Native Americans, there are Europeans, there are mixtures of all these different peoples, and like that. Now, Africa becomes the source of slave labor. It's, if you think about it, the rise of capitalism sort of gets formulated and developed, at the same time that slavery is, African slavery is being developed. They are kind of linked, all right? Something I like to point out in these classes is that there's not like a panel of guys that sits down in an office somewhere and says, let's have capitalism now. Let's not have obligations of peasants and nobles to one another. Let's pay wages to people and have these other, other features, lending and finance and, interest on loans and insurance and blah, 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 blah. No, it sort of all develops, I want to say organically, but nobody plans it out, all right? Nobody works it out. There's a need, and then there's a solution to the need, and it sort of goes along that way. Slavery arises in a similar way, but we'll get to that in a second. Once you have slavery, and I don't know, if you read the chapter, it points out that the Portuguese began the African slave trade by bringing Africans from West Africa to these islands in the Atlantic that they had, where they were going to grow sugar. The Madeiras, the Azores, they mentioned Sao Tome in here. These islands were either uninhabited or it was people that didn't have immunities to European diseases and they were wiped out. Okay. And it's a question for historians whether was racism a factor in picking Africans and taking them to those islands, or did the racism sort of come after, when slavery has grown much larger and you have to sort of rationalize this practice of treating people like poverty? Okay. I had a woman ask me, was it 2 semesters ago, I think. She was African American. She asked me, why did they pick on Africans? Why did Africans become the slaves? And you might think, oh, because of racism. But I think there's an argument to be made that the Portuguese had a need for labor and then had a source for labor in Africa. All right? And that was basically what drove it. Not some idea that Africans are subhuman and, whatever. I mean, the Portuguese couldn't have had that idea because they were engaged in commerce with these people. How do you engage in commerce with subhumans? It doesn't make any sense. They were selling rifles, exchanging rifles and stuff for slaves. So they couldn't have had that idea. But after a long time, and like I'm talking 50, 60 years maybe, you have to sort of explain or rationalize why you're holding Africans in slavery. And that's where you get these ideas that, Africa is completely uncivilized. Everybody's running around with poison darts and, cannibals and, that kind of stuff. And I would think in this day and age, there's not that much of that hanging around, except over the years, I've had students say some ridiculous things to me about Africa. I had a woman ask me, she said, I don't understand how you can get millions of people out of Africa when they're living in groups of 30. And I said, who told you they were living in groups of 30? And she said, well, some middle school or high school teacher told her. I said, that's just false. That's fake news, as we would say these days. There were cities that were as large as Florence in Italy in Africa. And even there are people that are living out in the, what's called the bush or the savannah, that kind of thing. sort of tribal groups, if you want to use that phrase. But even there, 30 people is not a viable human community. Even hunter-gatherers would be larger than 30. You know, that's just crazy thinking that. And then a while back, there was an older guy in my class, and he said that this is an argument you hear from racists, is that by taking Africans into slavery, we saved them from having to live in Africa, which is, according to our president, a shithole country. Okay, that's his words, not mine. But this kid said they wouldn't be eaten by tigers if they were taken to the New World, to the Western Hemisphere, which is so bizarre. First of all, there's no tigers in Africa. Tigers are in Asia. They're in India and parts of China. Okay. But the idea that the only thing that kept Africans from being eaten by, let's say, lions, was being taken into slavery is just a ridiculous child's idea of what Africa was like. And it's a bizarre thing. You take 12 million people out of a continent. I don't know how many people were living in Africa at any given time. It had to be more than 12 million, right? But you take 12 million people out. Say a tenth of them are extremely talented, okay? That's 120,000 extremely talented people that you've taken out of Africa and put to work in a cotton field or a sugar cane field or something like that. That messes Africa up tremendously. And then you trade with the African tribes on the coast and give them guns in exchange for slaves so that they can use the guns to get more slaves. That destabilizes Africa, okay? And then beginning in the 1870s, 1880s, you have like another 80 years of imperialism where Britain or France or Germany or Portugal are actually running these African countries for their benefit. And then you give them their independence and you say, look how fucked up Africa is. Oh, excuse me. Look how messed up Africa is. We saved those slaves from this place, from this, broken down place. And the textbooks like to do that. They point out that there are civilizations in Africa, big cities, Timbuktu. I like to joke about Timbuktu because pretty much every class I've ever taught, somebody's mother used the term Timbuktu to threaten them, clean your room or I'll send you to Timbuktu. I don't know if anybody listening has had that experience. And of course, you're not sure that it's a real place. It doesn't sound real, so. But Timbuktu is it's 75,000 people living there. That's a big city. There's like other places, there's history, there's a rise and fall of these different West African nations. The Portuguese are the first ones to get in there. And they start with slave raiding for those islands that I mentioned, the Azores, the Madeiras. I had a student one year who asked me, he said, did Africans trade other Africans as slaves? And I said, yes, that's how it worked. These Africans would grab those Africans from another ethnic group and send them off as slaves. And his response was to go like this, like we're rolled off the hook, okay? Which I thought was pretty funny. But that is how it worked. Now, there's a section on Islam and Christianity in early modern Africa. Parts of the Congo are influenced by Christianity, but Islam is much more influential in Africa, both in West Africa up here on the where the bend is, and then down on the east side by Zimbabwe, where Arab traders have brought Islam, in the process of marketing or selling stuff. Okay, when you get Islam, you get mosques, you get schools for Islamic studies, but other things as well. You get literacy, which is terribly important for a growing society. It's literacy basically in Arabic, although some of these societies have used the Arab alphabet to create an Arab grammar to make their own spoken languages, written languages. Right? It's a very important influence. It says that in the 16th century, the trading city of Timbuktu had a prominent Islamic university and 180 schools that taught the Quran. Students flocked to Timbuktu by the thousands from all parts of West Africa. Groups of 30, huh? Crazy. I wonder, literacy is sort of growing in Europe, beginning in, the 12th, with the printing press, the middle of the 15th century, it really starts growing. I wonder if Africa had more literate people than Europe at some point. Now, there's actually two slave trades going on. There's an Atlantic slave trade where Europeans are taking slaves to the Western Hemisphere. There's also an Islamic slave trade where slaves are going from East Africa into the Indian Ocean world as slaves. Okay, now slavery exists in Africa, and but it's different than slavery in the Western Hemisphere, because first of all, it can't be race based. Right? Now, race is a kind of I don't know what you would call it. It's not a real scientific term, okay? But all Africans are Africans. The slaves are Africans. The people that buy the slaves are Africans, okay? There's no difference in that sense between those people. So you don't have a situation in Africa where this group of people can be enslaved and this group cannot be enslaved. Anybody can be enslaved. Anybody can be a slave owner. Okay. The other thing is that they point out in here that slavery is not inherited by your children in Africa. You may be a slave, but your children are free when they're born. They're not born into slavery. Very often, slaves in the course of their lifetime become full members of the group that they've been attached to, and will gain their freedom as well. It's sort of a way of, keeping a group from becoming too close, too closed, all right? You bring in fresh blood from other places. In large parts of the world where slavery is practiced, slaves are not agricultural workers for the most part. In ancient Greece, they were the guys that taught the children, the tutors of the children of the wealthy. In the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s, they were advisors to the Sultan and stuff like that. It's only in the New World where it becomes that you use slaves mainly for agricultural labor. All right. Well, to give you an instance, it says Africans routinely purchased slaves to enlarge their families, and they often assimilated slaves into their kinship groups, so that within a generation a slave might obtain both freedom and an honorable position in a new family or clan. So there was like a progression, or something like that. All right. It says the earliest European slave traders were the Portuguese explorers, who seized 12 African men and took them to Portugal in 1441, which seems really early. And basically, they go on to explain what I was just talking about. The Portuguese bring people to the Azores, the Madeiras, the Cape Verde Islands, and Sao Tome. Okay? And they're growing sugar. Sugar apparently was a very lucrative crop. If you could grow sugar, you could make money. Right? And eventually they set up plantations on these islands where the majority of the population is African slaves, and there's a very small group of Europeans sort of supervising things, and they carry that model over to the Caribbean and then into Brazil. All right. 1518, the first shipment of slaves went from West Africa directly to the Caribbean. They were put on sugar plantations. I think 1619 is the date that Africans arrive in the British colonies, the English colonies in North America. They describe the triangular trade, and I've read books where it says basically that the triangular trade says manufactured goods are mainly guns, but also whiskey and pots and pans. What could go wrong? Whiskey and guns. Would go from Europe to West Africa, be exchanged for slaves, who were then brought to the New World, to the Western Hemisphere, and where they would be exchanged for sugar, which would then be shipped up to New England and turned into molasses and other products, and then they'd head back. So that's the triangle, all right? But I've read descriptions where it says that ships would load up with stuff and spend years trying to make a profit by sailing around the Atlantic and back and forth, maybe back and forth a couple of times for Africa to Caribbean and then up to New England and stuff like that. Like most things in history, it's more complicated than just the triangular trade. There's a middle passage which is pretty horrible as far as everything I have read or heard about it. Okay, we're horrified that the Nazis put all those people in camps and starved them and worked them to death. Okay, the middle passage is the beginning of that for African Americans, okay, or Africans that are coming to the Western Hemisphere. They're only the people shipping the slaves are only interested in profit. So they crowd the ships. There aren't sanitary facilities. There's no bathrooms. There's not really doctors. There's not a lot of food. What you figure is when you get to where you're going, Cuba or Brazil, you'll feed your slaves that are surviving, and make them look good before you sell them. That kind of thing. There was a document. I used to use this document set that had a guy named Thomas Nelson, who was a ship surgeon, and these British ships had made the slave trade illegal between internationally, and these British ships were stopping suspected slave ships, and this guy was inspecting them, and the conditions were just horrible. All sorts of diseases and sicknesses and conditions. We don't really know how many died in transit or committed suicide in transit, but it was a very significant number. And you read about it, and that's it. Okay. And it went on for centuries. It goes on for centuries. Ships packed with humans, 1/10 of them at least pass away on and they're just thrown overboard. I saw something just the other night. It mentioned that the women were. It was up to the captain to decide whether his men could have sex with the women that were enslaved. It says here, during the early days of the slave trade, mortality in the Middle Passage could exceed 50%. And eventually they got it down to about 5% per voyage. But 12 million people, that's a lot of dying. It's a pretty good map and chart here, that you can look at. Now the whole of Africa is disturbed by this. The shifts in power relations between the groups that had guns and the groups that didn't have guns and were liable to be turned into slaves is pretty significant. And it's. I was watching another thing with this guy. I think his name was Richard Spencer. He's like an avowed white supremacist. And he was running out that argument that by being taken as slaves, these people were rescued from from what Africa is today. Okay, and I just think that's a strange. You send Europeans in to do all these things to a continent, and then you say, well, we had to take the slaves out. We were doing a good thing by taking the slaves out because they don't have to live in the place that we messed up. It's kind of strange. There's a very interesting section in this chapter called, what is it called? Connecting the Sources. And it's mostly about Africans in the slave trade, who of course don't leave documents. They don't leave records of their what their existence is like. There are narratives by slaves and former slaves, but to get at how the actual life of slaves or workers or women sometimes or Native Americans or any groups but the elite groups, you have to sort of dig down, which is part of what I'm doing with those artifact assignments. Try to get you to get as much as you can out of a particular image or creative work or something like that. But you should read this just for your knowledge of the slave trade and how people were treated and how advertisements came up for people that are being sold. And also for ways of getting at the story of, say white workers, Polish workers or whoever, who, they're working 58 hours a week. They're not going to leave records. They're not going to leave big records. There's a woman named Rhiannon Giddens. She's African American. She was part of a group called the Carolina Chocolate Drops. And she does a powerful song that she wrote after she read an ad about a woman who was being sold, and I don't know exactly the period. It might have been the 19th century. But a young woman was being sold as a slave, and it mentioned that she had a baby that was like 9 months old at the purchaser's option, which means that you could buy the baby, for an additional price, whatever it was, but you didn't have to. You could have bought the mother and left the baby with some other woman, I guess, which is kind of bizarre. It's really hard to think about some of these things. I mean, in light of today's the Black Lives Matter thing, some people say, "Oh, slavery was so long ago. Why don't you give it a rest? Forget about it." The horrors were horrible, and they still have their effects. All right, now there's an African diaspora, which I don't know. I'm not sure what diaspora, where it comes from, like what language, but it's like a dispersal. People being pushed all around. There's an Irish diaspora. People talk about the famine years where many Irish went to the United States, many went to England, many went to Australia, other parts of the world, Canada, I think. There's a Jewish diaspora in sort of ancient times when Israel is destroyed and people are tossed. People go to Spain and Italy and other parts, Persia, whatever. And there's an African diaspora. People from West Africa going to North America, South America, the Caribbean, etc. All right? In most of these places, they're put to work on plantations, growing cash crops, and I don't know if they import their food or they grow their own food, but most of the land is given over to sugar or eventually tobacco, cotton, coffee in Brazil and some other places. They're really horrible. The plantations are horrible. Sugar plantations, I have read, created a situation where the life expectancy of a slave on a sugar plantation was 7 years. So they constantly had to bring in more people, okay? They also, it was usually way more men than women, so the population couldn't increase naturally. And one of the things that does is creates like a constant renewal of African roots. I don't know if that makes any sense, but if every 7 years you have to replace your, over the course of 7 years you have to replace all your slaves, and they're coming fresh from Africa, African religious ideas and languages and music and all these other things are not going to die out as readily as if if your population, your slave population is increasing naturally, like in the British colonies, the English colonies, right? A lot of stuff to think about. One thing that's important, what are the figures he gives? Of all the slaves delivered from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, about half went to Caribbean destinations and a third more went to Brazil. Only about 5% of enslaved Africans went to North American destinations. So what North America gets is a very small part of that 12 million people. They're mostly going to Brazil and to the Caribbean. They talk about slave results, slave revolts, and resistance to slavery. Resistance to slavery could take a lot of different forms. Just working slow would, sort of hold back, not allow you to be exploited as much as you would be if you worked as fast as the boss wanted, I guess. Sometimes you break tools. You think of other things to sort of lighten your load or just to get back at the boss or stuff like that. There's running away, and in the Caribbean at least, there are a lot of runaways. And I know in Jamaica they go up into the hills. They're called Maroons. I'm not sure where that name comes from. But very often they're very efficient fighters. They had warrior training in Africa, and they are able to set up communities of runaway slaves up in the hills and stuff like that. There are slave revolts. Everywhere there's slavery revolts. A lot of them are not successful because, the Europeans or who's ever running the show has military force that can put down a rebellion. But in 1793, there's a revolt in Saint-Domingue, which is a French colony that we now know as Haiti. And it's a slave revolt and like a political revolution, an anti-colonial revolution. Okay, they chase out the French. They abolish slavery. Slaves are now free people. And in 1804, they set up the first black republic in the world, right, in Haiti. And I read, there's never mind, we'll talk about that some other time. That, of course, the existence of Haiti drives 1804. It drives Southern slaveholders crazy. There's a conference at one point in Haiti, and Southerners object to American diplomats sort of meeting as equals with black Haitian diplomats. And so what they do is, I think they stall the whole thing until the conference is over, and just to avoid, a white diplomat shaking hands with a black diplomat. That's how crazy it all gets. I'm going to sort of jump over a few things here because I'm taking up a lot of time. It's impossible really to think of the prosperity and the growth of countries in the Western Hemisphere without acknowledging the contribution of slaves. Right? Growing these cash crops, performing all these different functions. Generally in a slave society that's, only blacks can be enslaved and whites can't be enslaved, there are very few opportunities for white people. Just about everything that needs to be done will be done by slaves. Carpentry work, leather work, roofing, even when these planters in the United States would have a ball in their big mansion, they wouldn't hire white musicians. They would have their slaves play. They would buy instruments for them and, uniforms or costumes that were appropriate. And they'd have, maybe they make them wear white wigs, I don't know. But they'd have them play rather than hire any white people. But the contribution of these billions of hours of labor hours, is just, you can't really imagine development of the New World without it. Okay, and they spend some time on the making of African American cultural traditions, which is important, I think. Africans were well, in Catholic countries, in Catholic colonies, they were much more able to keep their African religion together. In the Protestant areas, in the English colonies, there's no saints and there's none of this, what Catholics call popular religiosity or something like that. In places like Cuba and Brazil and Haiti, Catholic countries, they convert the slaves to Catholicism. And then the slaves are presented with this whole collection of saints, and they kind of relate this saint to that spirit from West Africa, and this saint to another spirit from West Africa, and there's candles and incense and all that kind of. They're able to keep a lot of it alive. Africans have influenced our language. I read an article at one time that explained where juke comes from, like in jukebox or juke joint, and funky and cool. The concept of cool. Oh, he's cool. That's kind of like a West African concept, and a bunch of others. Okay, and then in music, they've contributed a whole lot. Okay. I shudder to think what American music would sound like if there wasn't an African influence. Okay. This is one thing I like to do. What is the widest genre of pop music? And usually my students will say country. And then I'll say, well, what is the widest subgenre of country music? And maybe somebody will say bluegrass. And then I'll say, and what is the key instrument in bluegrass? And they'll say the banjo. And they know, up to now they know. And then I said, where does the banjo come from? And then they don't know. But the banjo is an African instrument. Not exactly the form that's in today, but that's where its roots are. There's a whole other thing of, different tonality, blues tonality, and the rhythms, the drums. I mean, the beats, that all comes from Africa. Polyrhythms, two rhythms going at the same time. In the United States, slave owners banned drums because they thought you could communicate over long distances with them, and they were too scared for that. But there is a place in New Orleans called Congo Square where I think up to the Civil War, on Sundays, African Americans or Africans would play drums and perform songs and stuff like that. And finally in the 19th century, slavery's, it's a long process, but slavery gets abolished. Okay, it starts with ending the trade in slaves across the oceans. Denmark does that in 1803. Great Britain in 1807. The United States in 1808. France in 1814. The Netherlands in 1817. And Spain in 1845. But that doesn't mean slavery is abolished, just that you can't buy slaves from Africa legally, right? Or the Caribbean legally. What happens in the United States, 1808 is the date, sort of in the Constitution, is that plantations in like Virginia and the Carolinas are now not only selling rice or tobacco, raising rice or tobacco to sell, they're raising people to sell. There's something like 400,000 slaves that are sold from what's called the Upper South to the Deep South between 1808 and 1865, or 1861 maybe, right? I figure that's 800 families that are kind of wrecked by that trade. It's kind of scary. Now, I have had discussions with people, friends of mine, people I'm not so friendly with, and they all want to, when you talk about slavery, they seem to imagine that the United States led the way. Oh, you know. Well, we did have a war that killed 600,000 people, but then we freed slaves in 1865. There were so many countries that had already banned slavery in their colonies and in their homeland. Mexico in 1821 has a constitution that abolishes slavery. They get their independence from Spain, and they abolish slavery. Right? Which is one of the reasons why white Texans are fighting against the federal government in Mexico in 1836, because they want to restore slavery. They want to make it legal again. In the British colonies, it's 1833, 1848 in the French colonies, 1865 in the United States, I already mentioned Mexico, 1886 in Cuba, and 1888 in Brazil. And then it says Saudi Arabia and Angola abolished slavery in the 1960s. I had no idea that there was slavery in Angola or Saudi Arabia. Well, Saudi Arabia I can imagine into the 1960s. So the United States is kind of in, the middle. Once the United States, in 1865, there's only really Cuba and Brazil that still have legitimate, have a slave system, right? And then finally they mentioned, despite the fact that slavery is illegal throughout the world, there are still people kind of working for nothing in a condition that amounts to slavery. So, all right. Anything else? I can't think of anything else. I do want to say one thing. Course messages rather than email, if you can. And I hope you guys are learning stuff. And your papers are due. The paper is due on the 15th. If for whatever reason you need more time, let me know. It can easily be arranged. Okay. And I think I'm gonna next time. Oh yeah, that looks much better. It's not so much a decapitated head. Why didn't I do that at the beginning? All right, doesn't matter. Have a good weekend. You deserve it.